I've covered courtrooms for 11 years. I've seen judges lose their tempers. I've seen lawyers cry. I've seen defendants collapse when the verdict was read. I've seen all of it. But I have never, not once in 11 years, seen a courtroom go completely, utterly silent the way it did that Thursday morning in February. Not from a verdict, not from a confession. From a man walking back through a door. Let me back up. The case itself wasn't extraordinary. Not by London standards, anyway. A civil dispute involving a property boundary near the grounds of a royal estate in Windsor, the kind of thing that sounds boring when you describe it at a dinner party. Two families, a stretch of wall. An old deed from 1987 that meant different things to different people depending on which solicitor you were paying. I was there because my editor had asked me to cover a sidebar story. There'd been some question about whether royal estate staff would be called as witnesses, and any time the words royal and witness appear in the same sentence, someone with a camera and a press pass shows up. That person was me. The courtroom itself was one of those older ones, high ceilings, dark wood panels. The kind of place that smells faintly of old paper and central heating that's been running since the 1970s. There were maybe 40 people in the public gallery, local press, a few observers from the estate's legal team, some curious members of the public who'd wandered in because the doors were open. And then there was him. He was sitting in the front row of the gallery off to the side near the door. Not in uniform, and that's important because I didn't know what he was at first. Mid-40s, I'd guess. Broad across the shoulders in the way that suggests someone who spent decades standing very still in very cold weather. Short hair. A jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He was wearing a plain, dark suit. No tie. He sat with his hands on his knees and his back completely straight. I noticed him because of how still he was. Everyone else in a courtroom fidgets. They check their phones. They shift in their seats. They whisper to the person next to them. This man did none of those things. He just watched, tracked the proceedings with steady, patient eyes like someone who had been trained to observe and had never quite switched it off. I found out later his name was Corporal Thomas Hadley. 14 years in the household division. 3 postings at St. James's Palace. 1 brief stint at Windsor. And now, for reasons that would become clear over the next 2 hours, seated in the public gallery of a civil court in Windsor on a Thursday morning. The dispute being argued that day had a complication. About 6 months prior, there had been an incident near the contested boundary. A man, the claimant's adult son, as it turned out, had allegedly crossed onto the estate grounds during an argument with a member of estate staff. The argument had escalated. Security had been called. There had been a confrontation. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a royal guard on foot patrol nearby had intervened. That guard was Thomas Hadley. He'd been called as a witness for the defense. His account of what he'd seen that evening was considered material to whether the boundary had been deliberately breached or whether the whole thing had been accidental. Simple enough, except that by the time Hadley had been on the stand for roughly 40 minutes, it was clear that simple was not going to be the word for this day. The claimant's solicitor was a man named Gerald Forsyth, early 60s, silver hair swept back from a wide forehead, the kind of lawyer who treats a courtroom like a stage and himself like the only actor worth watching. He had a way of pausing before he asked a question, a long, deliberate pause that made you feel like whatever was coming next was going to be devastating. He'd been circling Hadley for 20 minutes by then. Little questions, clarifying questions. What time did you begin your patrol? Where exactly were you positioned? Could you see the boundary marker from where you were standing? Yes or no, Corporal? Hadley answered everything calmly, precisely. No elaboration, no embellishment. He gave Forsyth exactly what was asked for and nothing more. And you could see that it was frustrating the solicitor, who clearly preferred witnesses who rambled, who gave him edges to pull on. Then Forsyth changed direction. He started asking about Hadley's record, about an incident from 8 years prior, something involving a complaint from a tourist, filed and then apparently dismissed, about the way Hadley had handled a situation outside St. James's. He was building toward something. I could feel it. The whole room could feel it. And then the judge, a woman named Justice Calloway, mid-50s, short gray hair, the kind of patience that comes from 3 decades on the bench, held up her hand. "Mr. Forsyth," she said very quietly, "what is the relevance of this line of questioning?" "I'm establishing the witness's pattern of conduct, Your Honor." "No," she said, "you're not. You're attempting to introduce character evidence through the back door and hoping I won't notice." She looked at him over her glasses. "I've noticed." Forsyth tried again. He rephrased. He pivoted. He explained at some length why the 8-year-old complaint was materially relevant to the case at hand. Justice Calloway listened to all of it with the expression of someone watching a child try to convince her that the broken vase broke itself. Then she turned to Corporal Hadley. "I'm going to ask you to step out of the courtroom for a few minutes while I address a legal matter with counsel. Please wait outside." Hadley nodded once, stood, walked to the door with the same unhurried steadiness he'd walked in with. The door closed behind him. And then Justice Calloway took Forsyth apart. "I won't pretend I understood all of it. I'm a journalist, not a lawyer, but the general shape of what happened was this. Forsyth had been trying to introduce evidence that Justice Calloway considered inadmissible. She told him this. He argued. She told him again, more firmly. He argued again, and at some point she leaned forward slightly and said, in the kind of voice that doesn't raise itself to make a point, "Mr. Forsyth, if you attempt to reintroduce this material through any further questioning, I will be having a different kind of conversation with your professional association." "Are we clear?" We were clear. The whole room was clear. The woman 2 seats down from me let out a breath she'd been holding for about 5 minutes. Forsyth sat down. Justice Calloway shuffled her papers, looked toward the door. "Please ask the witness to return." The court officer went to the door, opened it, said something, came back. "Your Honor," he said, and there was something uncertain in his voice. "He's not there." The courtroom shifted. Not a lot, just people straightened slightly, looked at each other. The kind of collective movement that happens when a situation becomes slightly undefined. Justice Calloway frowned. "Not there." "The hallway's empty, ma'am. I've asked at the clerk's office. No one's seen him." Now there was actual murmuring, low but real. Someone behind me whispered something to their neighbor. Forsyth was looking at his papers, but not reading them, doing that thing lawyers do when they're trying to appear more composed than they are. A 10-minute recess was called. People stretched. A few checked their phones. The court officer came back twice with no new information. I have to tell you, there was a particular quality to the uncertainty in that room. It wasn't alarm exactly, more like the particular unease of a situation that doesn't follow its expected script. A witness had been asked to wait outside. The witness was gone, in a civil case that no one had particularly expected to be memorable. And then, at 11 minutes past the recess, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. He wasn't in a dark suit anymore. He was in full ceremonial dress. The red tunic, the tall bearskin hat held in the crook of one arm, medals, and there were several catching the courtroom light. Trousers pressed to a line sharp enough to cut yourself on. Boots polished so deeply black they looked painted. He looked like he'd stepped out of the changing of the guard and walked directly here. It took a moment for the room to understand what it was looking at. It was the kind of silence that happens in stages. First, the people at the front noticed. Then the people behind them. Then someone near the back actually said, out loud, "Oh my God," and the person next to them hushed them, but not very convincingly because they were thinking the same thing. He walked to the front of the room, unhurried, straight-backed. And you need to understand the sound of those boots on that old wooden floor. The measured, deliberate rhythm of it. It was like a metronome. It was like something counting down. He stopped at the witness box, looked at Justice Calloway. "Your Honor," he said, "I apologize for the delay." Justice Calloway was quiet for a moment, and I have been thinking about that pause ever since because I think it contained several things simultaneously. Surprise, appraisal, possibly the very beginning of something like amusement, though her face showed none of it. "Corporal Hadley," she said, "you've changed." "I have, Your Honor," a pause of his own. "I was asked to step outside. I used the time to collect something from my vehicle." "Your uniform." "My uniform." Another pause. "Sit down, Corporal." He sat, and the questioning continued. But the room was different now, fundamentally different in a way that's hard to fully explain in print. Forsyth stood up to resume his cross-examination, and he was visibly recalibrated. The confident staginess was still there, because men like Forsyth don't lose it entirely, but it was quieter, more careful, like someone who'd been reminded, unexpectedly, that other people in the room had their own kind of authority. Hadley answered every question the same way he had before, plainly, accurately, without ornamentation. He said what he had seen on the evening in question. He described the position of the parties. He described what had been said and what had been done. He did not embellish. He did not waver. He did not look at Forsyth the way someone looks at an opponent. He looked at him the way someone looks at weather, noting it, accounting for it, not particularly troubled by it. At one point Forsyth asked him, with studied casualness, why he'd chosen to return in uniform. There was a pause, not a defensive pause, a considered one. "When I'm asked to give evidence," Hadley said, "I want to be clear about who is giving it." Nobody wrote anything for a moment, then everyone wrote it down at once. I spoke to people afterward, in the corridor outside while the solicitors were collecting their things. A woman who'd been sitting near the front told me she'd started crying and couldn't entirely explain why. "It wasn't sad," she said. "It was just I don't know." It was like watching someone say something without words. A retired solicitor who'd been observing told me he'd been coming to courts for 30 years and he'd never seen anything quite like it. "The man made a statement," he said, "without saying a word. He walked in and told that courtroom exactly what he thought it needed to hear." The court officer who'd gone to look for Hadley and found an empty hallway told me with a slightly dazed expression that he'd only been gone a few minutes. "He must have moved fast," he said. "To get to his car, get changed, I mean, he must have been very quick." I thought about that, about someone in a car park somewhere in February cold, changing into a ceremonial uniform with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. Not performing. Not making a scene, just deciding quietly what was required. I tracked down one of Hadley's former colleagues a few days later, someone who'd served alongside him for several years at St. James's. I asked about him. "Thomas," the man said, and smiled in a way that suggested the question wasn't surprising. Thomas is the real thing. You know how you meet people sometimes and you think, yes, that's what this is actually supposed to look like. That's him." He told me about a posting during a particularly tense period when crowds had been difficult and press presence had been relentless and the pressure on the guards had been significant. "Thomas just stood there," he said. "Every day, I never once saw him rattled." Some of the younger lads would come off a shift looking wrecked. Thomas would come off looking exactly the same as when he went on. "Is that unusual?" I asked. "For most of us, yes. For him," a pause, "no." The case itself concluded about 3 weeks after that Thursday. The judge found in favor of the defense on the main points of the boundary dispute. The incident near the estate boundary, as described by Corporal Hadley, was accepted as consistent with the defense's account. I don't know if the uniform made a difference to the outcome. Probably not directly. Verdicts aren't won by gestures, and Justice Calloway was not the kind of judge whose decisions are swayed by the theatrical. But I keep thinking about what that retired solicitor said in the corridor. About making a statement without words. Because here's what Hadley actually did when you break it down to its simplest parts. He was told to wait. He waited. He used the time. He came back not angry, not sulking, not diminished. He came back having decided who he wanted to be seen as, and he walked through that door in the full weight of 14 years of service and let it speak for itself. I've thought about that walk a lot since February. There's something in it that goes beyond the courtroom, beyond the case, beyond even the uniform. It's about a particular kind of response to being dismissed. Because that's what being sent out of the room is at some level. You are removed, sidelined, told to wait in the hall while the grown-ups sort things out. Most people, when they're sent out of a room, come back a little smaller, a little more careful. They've been reduced and they feel it. Hadley came back larger than when he left. Not louder, not angrier, just larger, more completely himself, and the room felt it before he said a single word. I saw him one more time, a few months after the case. I was near St. James's on a different assignment, and I happened to pass through the area where the guards post. I recognized him immediately. That stillness is not a common thing. He was in full ceremonial dress, obviously, as he would be, standing at his post, tourists drifting past, someone trying to take a photograph too close. He didn't move. He never moves. And I stood there for a moment just watching him, and I thought about that Thursday, about a courtroom going quiet in stages, about the sound of boots on old wood, about a man who, when given a few minutes in a car park, chose to come back as himself. fully, unapologetically, completely himself. I don't think I've ever admired anyone more for doing so little. Because it wasn't little at all,